Right, some of you had requested to look at what a good essay looks like, so I thought I would walk through a sample for the Wolseley essay that we just did. The Wolseley one was created before the new rubric happened, but this sample was considered high on that scale, and it would still score very well on the current scale. So I thought we would look through it, talk about what makes it a successful essay, and we'll go from there. So let me just export this quickly to my OneNote. And so when we're looking at the samples, what I'm really going to pay close attention to is that we see how their thesis would get that thesis point, how, oops, where is it? Oh, wait, there it is. How their commentary avoids any gaps, how their evidence is specific and relevant, all the language of the rubric. I want to show you where I'm seeing that in this sample. So, a writer must employ a variety of rhetorical devices in order to convey the emotions of a character. If these techniques are used well, the character becomes more real to the reader. In his play Henry VIII, author William Shakespeare does a remarkable job of conveying the emotions of his character Cardinal Wolsey, who has just received the shock of his dismissal as the king's advisor. Shakespeare's description description is realistic. Sorry, I couldn't read it right. Shakespeare's description is realistic because it reflects the range of feelings people often undergo when reeling from an unexpected disappointment. Wolsey's soliloquy reveals both anger and lamentation as he struggles to come to terms with what has occurred. Shakespeare portrays both the hostility and despair of Wolsey's reaction through dramatic diction, figurative language, and a shift in tone. So a couple things that are good about this. Now, this intro, it's nice, and it kind of sets up this premise that emotions are complicated and stuff. But in particular, nothing about that part kind of stood out to me. It's more so later on when they kind of come into their own in terms of describing what's happening. So honestly, I think this particular sample, the best of this paragraph, is right here at the end. It says, Wolsey's soliloquy reveals both anger and lamentation. Remember, when we're talking about complexity, we're also talking about duality, or two feelings that seem contradictory working together. So that's a great example of that, anger and lamentation. They also do that then when they talk about hostility and despair. Those are two different emotions. They're kind of in the same family, right? But they're still complex because he's hostile, but he's also sad about it. So there's anger and sadness. So this writer definitely has a very clear sense of what makes Wolsey's reaction complex. So when we've been talking about in class, we've been using that blank yet blank format. But what I like about this one is it still has those two blanks, right? Hostile, despairing. But they've kind of phrased it more so to fit their thesis statement, which is totally fine. We have this as a guide, but once we can just kind of identify these two words, you can fit them into the sentence however you want. And then, of course, this person has choices laid out as well. So their first paragraph starts, the words Shakespeare chooses reflects Wolsey's complex reaction because they represent strong emotion. Wolsey describes himself as weary, which implies that he has poured everything he has into his position, leaving him exhausted. Weary connotes aging, as if Wolsey has expended a great amount of time in his dedication to his work. I want to highlight this particular sentence. Whenever we are talking about diction, tone in particular, you can't just say that the words, we can't just say, yeah, Wolsey is weary. Therefore, we know that he has spent a lot of time dedicated to his work. It's kind of making too much of a jump. What this one is doing a good job is really explaining the specific evidence. Lots of times when I read essays from you guys, the commentary that comes after an example doesn't have any connection back to that. And what we call that is cohesiveness, right? The previous sentence alluded to this weariness. The second sentence is building, and every sentence should be building on the prior. That's what creates a cohesive essay. So this is a great example of mastery commentary because it has a very specific explanation and link between the evidence and what that has to do with diction, which means word choice, connotation, denotation, right? Even more powerful is the selection of the word wretched which Wolsey uses to characterize men such as himself who have had their lives depending on the approval of the monarch. The connotations of wretched are despair and hopelessness. Again, they did the same thing. They didn't just give me the example. They explained why, when they're talking about connotation, let me put this here. He says the word connotation, but really what he's telling me is why do certain words make a reader feel a certain way. And this is not an easy task. If you think about it, it's hard to explain why saying someone is not very bright is better than calling them stupid. But they connote and they create a different reaction. But because this writer does that in here, they are definitely on track in understanding how diction works. So when we choose to write about diction and we choose to write about tone, we are doing something really, we need to do something really challenging, which is telling me why do words make people feel a certain way. And that can be really challenging. What makes this sample successful is this writer does acknowledge why certain words in his evidence elicit a certain feeling. This word choice suggests that Wolsey has no hope whatsoever for the future, leaving him in a state in utter desperation. The loaded diction Shakespeare uses illuminates the extremity of Wolsey's emotional state. So another thing here, remember their thesis? They were saying that he was hostile and despairing. Well, here's our desperation right here. It's just a different form of the same word, but there's the link to thesis. So what this paragraph has done is it set out, right, a claim. It has evidence that has a very clear link to the technique, in this case, diction. So that's what I was talking about when they're explaining the connotation, right? And then down here, we have their link to thesis, which is really clear and fits in with what they said prior. Like I said, so that's the organization definitely makes sense. They have the commentary that both explains the technique and they link to thesis. But I also mentioned that this is a very cohesive paragraph because each idea is building on the previous. Like here he mentions weary, well in the next sentence he's going to elaborate on that. And he does that throughout. Just like here he talks about hopelessness, builds on that, talking about how that connects to his state of despair. So each thought is building on the previous. Let's look at another paragraph. Through figurative language, Shakespeare evokes powerful images that show Wolsey's anger as well as despair. He uses the metaphor of a delicate flower to represent Wolsey's spirit, fast optimistically putting out the tender leaves of hope, then blooming, only to be struck by a killing frost. This image conveys Wolsey's vulnerability and innocence. So a couple things. First of all, they have a very clear claim right there, right? I know exactly what they're going to be writing about. But I wanted to point out this evidence integration. This is such a natural way of integrating the evidence. And what it is he's used little pieces, right? This is what we call our semi-paraphrase, right? He's used the little pieces, but essentially he's combined paraphrase with direct quotes. And what that allows the writer to do is it just sounds like it's part of his argument, right? It sounds like, yes, I'm presenting evidence from the passage, but that evidence is really working to prove my point, which is that he was hopeful, but then he got struck down, okay? So we talk about using evidence, right? But we also want to think about how we are integrating that evidence. The image conveys Wolsey's vulnerability and innocence, explaining what that is. The frost, which symbolizes the king's brash dismissal of Wolsey, is cruel and undeserving. Is cruel and undeserved. By placing the sprouting, blooming, and death of the flower within a 3-day span, Shakespeare reflects Wolsey's anger at how suddenly he fell from favor. So this part right here, I'm going to switch to my pink right here. What's good about this particular part is they are really putting their example into context. They are making this comparison that the frost is like the king, so they've created a relationship in their own argument, and then explaining how that relates to his fall, again using the evidence of the 3-day span. This is another thing that successful essays will do. This person has clearly read the prompt. They understand the context of what's going on for this character, and so they're not only adding detail to their writing, but they're adding the significance throughout. So Shakespeare also uses figurative language to show Wolsey's hopelessness. Using simile, he likens Wolsey to Satan, the angel who fell out of God's favor and was banished to hell, never to return again. The comparison reflects Wolsey's connection that he has no reason for hope and must instead expect misery for the rest of his life. So here again is our explanation of the technique. This writer doesn't outright say that this is a metaphor, but that's what he's talking about, right? Or he says simile, right, where he's likening Wolsey to Satan, but he doesn't just say, oh, he compares himself to Satan, the angel who had a bad break, therefore he's miserable. No, it explains he explains why particularly. Why is Wolsey like Lucifer? It doesn't just point saying that there is a comparison, it actually explains the comparison that's being made. These two powerful uses of imagery portray the two emotions between which Wolsey variates? I don't know what word that's supposed to be, but vacillates, that's what it is. The vacillates is just a fancy word for goes between. So again, just like we talked about up here with connotation, it's so important to explain the technique. Analytic writing is about how, so you need to explain to me how is this evidence, like I said before, connected to a technique. Oops. And in this particular one, he does have a link to thesis here. It's not the most elaborate or thorough link to thesis, but he does kind of relate back to this idea of the two emotions. All right, next paragraph. Shakespeare also employs a change in tone to convey the complexity of Wolsey's emotions. At first, the tone is bitter. Wolsey scoffs at the idea of losing the little good he gains from the king. He describes the world as vain, superficially focused on status, and declares, I hate ye. This is another example of really good evidence integration. He's pulling from lots of different parts, but he's just taking little snapshots, right? The little good, vain, I hate ye. He's kind of using them all together to really just kind of make his own point. This tone reveals Wolsey's hostility, his first reaction. So another thing I want to point out about talking about tone, especially when it's a change in tone, you want to talk about them in isolation. So here, he's talking about how Wolsey has a bitter tone. Well, down here, he's going to talk about despair. Sometimes we get caught up in that all the evidence has to be right here in this little area, but sometimes you split it up and say, okay, well, I'm going to show you where he's bitter, and then just like this writer does, I'm going to show you where they're despairing, and in between those parts, I'm going to provide a little commentary. In this case, the linking that evidence to the technique that we were just talking about. So as it continues, it says, immediately afterward, he shifts to a tone of happiness and despair. He laments the life he had led as a wretched man, beholden to a ruler, expressing self-pity through his characterization of himself as a poor man. Again, strong writer, because they can just kind of grab pieces of the evidence. A word here, a different phrase there. Wolsey concludes by asserting that he will never have any hope for the future. There again, they're explaining the technique, which in this case is tone, and they're saying he is despairing. Well, he doesn't have any hope for the future. So in this case, they made their claim, evidence 1, and then they explain the technique. Evidence 2, then they explain the technique. This particular format is really kind of necessary with tone, especially if we're talking about a tonal shift, because if I didn't have this piece right here, I would be left wondering, well, how does this first part show this bitter tone? I gotta stop and be like, okay, well, here's my evidence I just gave you. I want to make sure you understand that this is where he's being hostile and bitter, right? Before I dive in to my next part. The change in the tone between bitterness and hopefulness reflects the emotions between which Wolsey is struggling. His initial anger gives way to sadness and self-pity. Through this change, Shakespeare reflects the emotional reaction as often multifaceted. And then down here, because we've already done our evidence and we've already kind of explained our technique, now we're just going to link it to thesis and explain how this is showing his complex response, which is exactly what it does. Okay, and then they do have a conclusion. You certainly don't need a conclusion, but this person had time and said, using powerful diction, evocative figurative language, and a change in tone, Shakespeare portrays Wolsey's response to his dismissal as both hostile and despairing. This is a good recap of their thesis, right? The word Wolsey used reflect the strength of his emotions. The courage he creates fortifies this description, and the shift in tone emphasizes the split between his emotions. By employing these three tactics, Shakespeare reflects the powerful complexity of Wolsey's reaction and of human emotion as a whole. So one last thing that this writer did that's really good is they start alluding to the big picture or bigger implications, right? He's talking about humanity as a whole. So we're getting to what I like to call the so what at the very end, which is a great way of demonstrating sophisticated thought. So this particular essay, it's good for a lot of reasons, to be honest with you. But just as a recap, first and foremost, they have a very clear response to the prompt in their, I'll use my rainbow pen. They have a clear argument, because analytic writing is still an argument, and his argument is this, that he is hostile and despairing over his rejection, right? Then the second body paragraph, it has this really clear structure that we've been talking about, but we also mentioned that it's cohesive, meaning that this idea builds on the next idea. This idea builds on the next idea, right? It keeps focused, but it also keeps adding to something the previous sentence said. This paragraph, we talked about the evidence integration, and that's something that this writer does well throughout. But we also talked about putting things into context and explaining the technique. In this case, the symbol or the comparison that's being made. And this is something that universally we're struggling with, is explaining what is, not identifying what technique is being used, but being able to show me what is this link between the evidence and the overall purpose, okay? And then last, we talked about tone. This is a great structure for talking about tonal shift. I'm going to give you evidence, but then I'm going to explain Why does it show that tone? And I'm going to give you more evidence, and then I'm going to explain the second tone. And then I'm going to go ahead and explain why that shift contributes to the thesis I presented overall. So lots of good things happening in this sample, which is why it's a high scoring sample, but it's also something you're very capable of. These are things we talk about and I see a lot, but we just kind of got to get to a point where we can do all of them together in the same essay.